Furious parents were escorted from an inquest by police amid angry scenes after a coroner found a hospital's failure to carry out a brain scan may not have caused their daughter's death. Victoria Olabode, 12, died after suffering a stroke in hospital brought on by sickle cell disease in 2019, with her family waiting nearly 5 years for the inquest. In an internal report in 2020, Royal Manchester Children's Hospital admitted that a 3-day delay in giving Victoria a scan contributed to her death. But when coroner Zach Golombek gave his finding that earlier treatment may not have saved her, Victoria's mother Elizabeth shouted and knocked water jugs from desks, and her father Victor joined the loud protest. Mr. Golombek told Manchester Coroner's Court there was insufficient evidence to show Victoria would have avoided the stroke had she received an earlier scan. He said none of the failings more than minimally contributed to her death. Police removed an emotional Mr. and Mrs. Olabode, who had begged clinicians to give her daughter a brain scan for 3 days before the stroke was eventually found. The inquest resumed over an hour after the disturbance, and Mr. Olabode was allowed back in. Described by loved ones as a beautiful girl who would light up a whole room, Victoria died at the Royal Manchester Children's Hospital on July 15, 2019. The schoolgirl who had sickle cell disease had been transferred there from North Manchester General Hospital 13 days earlier, the inquest heard. On July 5th, 3 days after her admission, had suddenly developed a severe headache and began vomiting. She was treated for her pain, but her mother had persistently asked for a CT scan to be carried out, which was not done until July 8th, when Victoria suffered a prolonged seizure. She suffered a second seizure later that day and was afterwards admitted to the hospital's pediatric intensive care unit, where radiology confirmed she had suffered an ischemic brain injury. After she was found to be brainstem dead on July 15th, her ventilation was withdrawn, leading to her death. The inquest heard 6 days of evidence in December last year and February this year. Expert witness Professor Fenella Kirkham told the hearing, if the diagnosis had been made between the evening of July 5th and the early hours of July 8th, then I think appropriate preventative strategies, as I have set out in the report, would have meant that on the balance of probabilities, Victoria wouldn't have died. In his conclusion this morning, Mr. Golombek said he found it was a failure that a CT or MRI scan was not carried out on July 5th or 6th, when it was clear that Victoria was suffering serious neurological symptomatology. He said, Victoria was in sickle crisis, and it was imperative for a neurological event to be excluded by neurological examination and imaging. A CT scan was warranted, and whilst it was appropriate for the clinicians to address Victoria's pain, her pain and a potential neurological event were not mutually exclusive. However, he said that had a scan or scans been carried out at that time, it would not have conclusively confirmed subarachnoid blood, the medical term for a type of stroke caused by bleeding on the surface of the brain, as the scans carried out 2 days later didn't do so either. He described the protocol for the MRI scan that was carried out as suboptimal and said that this too was a failure in the care. But Mr. Golombek added, on the balance of the evidence following my analysis, I find that there is insufficient evidence to cross the threshold beyond speculation that Victoria's death would have been avoidable with earlier imaging on July 6, 2019. On the balance of probabilities, there's insufficient evidence that she would have avoided the terminal event on July 8th, which caused her death on July 15th. Flowing from my findings, in my judgment, Victoria has died from a naturally occurring illness which sadly reached its natural end on July 15, 2019. Whilst I have found failures in her care, none of these failures more than minimally contributed to her death on the balance of probabilities. It was at this point that Mrs. Olabode stood up and began screaming, "No!" and she never died of natural causes. Despite requests for her to calm down, she continued to shout, with items including jugs of water being knocked from the desks in the courtroom. Her husband then joined the loud protests, which saw staff and others flood the room as proceedings were halted. Everyone was asked to leave, with several police officers coming into the courtroom a short time afterwards, with Mr. and Mrs. Olabode from Rochdale, Greater Manchester, being escorted out. The hearing resumed around an hour later with Mr. Olabode present, along with Victoria's twin brother, Victor Jr. Concluding his remarks, Mr. Golombek said, "I am conscious that the totality of my findings will not be readily accepted by Victoria's family, to whom I pay the utmost respect for their fight for justice over the past nearly 5 years. I have analyzed the evidence thoroughly and carefully in what has been a less than straightforward case on the medical issues, to which I have been greatly assisted by all witnesses and advocates. The earlier report on behalf of the Children's Hospital accepted there was an ongoing fixation on the perception that Victoria was having a painful sickle cell crisis, and her ongoing headaches were not escalated by junior doctors when she was admitted in July 2019. We accept that, as a result of the delay in carrying out imaging, there was a delay which contributed to Victoria's death from stroke, and we are very sorry for this," the hospital said in the report. Greater Manchester Police said one man at the inquest was de-arrested, while a woman was arrested on suspicion of a public order offence. A GM police spokesman said this evening, "There is believed to have been an altercation at the coroner's court. One man was de-arrested, but a woman aged 40 was arrested on suspicion of a public order offence and remains in custody." Speaking outside, Mr. Olabode said the family would continue their fight for justice for their daughter. Earlier in the inquest in February, Mr. Olabode shouted in court that 5 years of our lives have been wasted. During legal arguments prior to the resumption of the evidence and appearing to fear a further delay to proceedings which have already had to be adjourned on several previous occasions, he told the coroner, "This is the last time we're coming to this court. You have wasted our time. After this, we're going straight to the hospital, and there will be continuous protest. I will not take this any longer." Tolly Onum, Chief Medical Officer at Manchester University NHS Trust, said, "We apologize again for where our care has fallen short of the high standards to which we aspire. The Trust has undertaken a thorough investigation to examine the circumstances following Victoria's very sad death nearly 5 years ago, and we apologize again for where our care has fallen short of the high standards to which we aspire. We have taken steps to ensure the learning from Victoria's death has been shared within the Trust. Families' anger as coroner rules hospital failings minimally contributed to their teen daughter's death. Parents are escorted from court after ruling finds young sickle cell sufferer 12 died of natural causes.